Hello and good afternoon. Welcome from the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom to our first seminar in the new Anti-Corruption Evidence Seminar Series, which we at the University of Sussex Centre for the Study of Corruption are co-hosting with our colleagues in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme, our colleagues being SOC ACE, Serious Organised Crime ACE, based at the University of Birmingham, and SOAS ACE, School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where they host one of the 3 ACE programs. Today, we're going to be looking at state capture with 2 eminent experts in the field. We'll start off hearing from Liz David-Barrett, who will be doing a joint presentation with Danny Kaufmann. Now, neither of them will need any introduction on this subject, but notwithstanding that, I'm going to say a few words about them. Danny Kaufmann is well known, I think, to all of us. He's a giant in this field, and it's been such a privilege to have him here this morning talking to our master's students. Any one of the things that I'm about to read out would be a significant life's achievement if any of us had done them, but he's done all of them, which is absolutely stupendous. Starting, of course, with the World Bank's World Governance Indicators, which were such a transformational index in that field. And then moving on to definitions of legal corruption, the sense that corruption isn't always breaking the law. Again, a huge contribution to the studies in that area. He then had a look at natural resource governance with the Resource Governance Index, itself a vast contribution. But of course, much of his early work was in the field of state capture, which with Joel Hellman, he really pioneered looking at this subject. That subject has matured over the last 20 years since he first wrote so authoritatively on it. And today we're going to look at how it's changed and how it applies in the contemporary world. Starting us in that journey will be Liz David-Barrett, who will give the first few slides in the presentation. Liz is the director here at our Centre for the Study of Corruption, based in the University of Sussex. She started her professional life as a journalist with The Economist and Financial Times, principally looking at the Balkans. The connection there with state capture will elude nobody, I think, who's here today. She then continued life as a research fellow at the University of Oxford. When she came to Sussex, she started delving more deeply into the subject of public procurement, and much of her work on public procurement is well known in this field. But latterly, she's returned to the subject that she covered at the start of her research, state capture. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce both Danny and Liz. We're going to have a presentation that will last about 25 minutes, and then we'll move into about 30 minutes of Q&A. We have slightly diminished technical facilities today, and I should thank everybody for joining us today, notwithstanding our change of date, which was due to rather unforeseen circumstances. What that means is that the way we're going to do the Q&A is ask people to put their questions into the chat along with their name and institution. And I will be moderating by picking questions up from the chat and passing them to Danny and Liz after they've done their presentation. So any questions that occur to you, either as you go along or at the end, please post them in the chat. And if we don't get to all of them, then first of all, sorry in advance. But secondly, it will be interesting for other people to see in the chat what the trend of the questions is as well. So with that, I'm going to pass to Liz David-Barrett, who's going to share her screen. There's no need for anybody else to have their cameras on at this point. So please feel free to turn off cameras during the presentation phase. Liz, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Just waiting to resolve the tech. Great. Thanks. So delighted to be here and in such esteemed company talking to you today about state capture and development. So what we're going to talk about today, we are going to, first of all, talk about the concept itself. What is state capture and how has the concept evolved over the years? Why should we care about it? Why does it matter? What's its impact on development and security? And then we'll look at how and why to quantify it. And here Danny will show some data from his new state capture index, which is hot off the press. Finally, we'll address the question of what can we do about it as practitioners of anti-corruption. So what is state capture? Really, the concept started being proposed by Daniel Kaufmann and together with Joel Howman in the year 2000. And they came up with a concept to describe a pattern that they were seeing when they were observing how economic and political transition was happening in the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe. In particular, what they saw was that there seemed to be a few business interests, we often call them the oligarchs now, and particularly in Russia, and these business interest groups seemed to be able to improperly influence the formation of laws and policy. And so they coined the term state capture to address this form of corruption, which they noticed was different to the kinds of corruption that most people were focused on, which was much more the administrative side, administrative corruption or bureaucratic corruption. And that was about improperly getting around the implementation of laws and policy. So the difference, in a way, administrative corruption is about getting around the rules. State capture is about actually changing the rules of the game. The important thing about state capture then is that it bakes in that unfair advantage. So it can have a quite long-term harm and in terms of changing the rules of the game there. But at the same time, it might take place within existing legal norms. And actually, the point then about state capture is that if you've changed the laws, then what you're doing afterwards is not necessarily going to be illegal. Now, that form of state capture, key features, it was about business interest groups shaping the rules of the game, and there was this distinction between administrative corruption and state capture. What we've seen over the last 15 years is that, in fact, this is a concept which has come back, which did not just disappear with the democratization process and with economic transition to the market, but it's something which instead seems to have cropped up again and again. And most famously in South Africa, the presidency of Jacob Zuma has been characterized as marked by state capture, in which business interest groups, the Gupta brothers, were able to collude with Zuma in capturing the state. It's also been used to refer to Hungary under Orban, Turkey under Erdogan, Sri Lanka under the Rajapakshas, India under Modi, Brazil under Bolsonaro, and indeed the United States under Donald Trump. So what's interesting about this new phenomena is that it's not necessarily the business interests that are leading this. It's in fact the political leaders, and they're often people who are democratically elected, but once they get into power, they abuse that power and consolidate more power. Now, this kind of politics-led capture, it's also been called incumbent capture, party capture, or executive takeovers in the literature. But it actually is much more ambitious in a way than that original form of state capture. And it's not just about shaping the rules of the game now, but it's also moving into two further spheres. It's about controlling that implementation pillar or sphere. And so that's still different to administrative corruption because it's more systematic. So it's about using powers of public appointments to put your own cronies into positions where you can use them to control the way that state resources are allocated, whether through the budget or through allocating public procurement contracts. It also then moves into a third sphere. So if you are a capture group that wants to capture the state, you clearly want to shape the rules of the game and control how those rules are implemented. But particularly in a democratic context, you will face challenges from the accountability institutions, which are supposed to check your power and scrutinize what you're doing. And so for this new modern form of state capture, what we see is that you also need to move into a third sphere. You need to disable those accountability institutions like supreme audit institutions, the judiciary, law enforcement institutions. So this new form of capture has these three pillars. I'm just going to briefly talk about some examples of that. So in Hungary, we see that Orban got into power in 2010, immediately rewrote the constitution and introduced and changed a huge number of laws. For an example of the second pillar, Zuma and state capture in South Africa focused a lot on this implementation pillar, although moving into all three pillars. And actually, Zuma let the Gupta brothers control key government appointments to the finance ministry and to the heads of state-owned enterprises. By controlling those institutions, they were able to allocate state resources out to the Guptas and their allies. And in the third sphere, in Sri Lanka, under the Rajapakshas, we saw that they got into power and gutted the anti-corruption agency and audit agencies, removing their status and their powers. Why then do we hear different terms used for this phenomenon? So there are a lot of different terms that we hear: grand corruption, kleptocracy, democratic backsliding. And I thought it might just be worth saying a word about what I see as the analytical and practical advantages of these different terms. Grand corruption is the abuse of high-level power that benefits the few at the expense of the many. This term is particularly useful for looking at individual transactions, but individual transactions of grand corruption will not necessarily add up to state capture, and they're not necessarily a systematic effort to change the rules of the game. They might be quite opportunistic. Kleptocracy, a term we often hear now. It means rule by thieves, and it implies that political elites are abusing their power in order to steal from the state. This is a really useful term, I think, in demonstrating the contrast with democracy. So very often quite useful for advocacy purposes, but it does tend to assume that the motivation is always theft and theft only. It also focuses only on political elites, so we lose the non-state actors that might engage in capture. Thirdly, democratic backsliding. This is the weakening of democratic institutions and move towards autocracy. And it recognizes that democratization is not inevitable. We're not necessarily always going to be moving in one direction. But at the same time, it also suggests that the process is somewhat accidental rather than intentional. So what I think are the advantages of state capture as a concept: it recognizes the agency and the intent of the capture groups. It focuses on the behaviors and the process of capture, so not just on actors, not just about good guys versus bad guys, but that allows us to see capture as multidimensional, and importantly, as not binary. So we're not necessarily talking about whether a state is captured or not, but we're talking about degrees of capture. And that means that we can map out these mechanisms of capture and use that to help us diagnose the early warning signs and to build resilience. All this is important because state capture is more harmful than your more administrative corruption, I would argue, or at least into the long term. And it has an impact on the economy, on society, and on security. In terms of economic development, we can see that if we're skewing economic development towards a few narrow interest groups, we're going to reduce competition. Over time, you're going to find the healthier companies in an economy will be losing out they won't be winning any public procurement contracts. They won't be benefiting from the privileges that those captor groups are benefiting from. So over time, you'll see the valuable parts of the economy eroding. You'll get less investment. And often the captor groups are running down the strategic assets in the economy, utilities, etc., infrastructure, which is so important for the rest of economic growth. In terms of society, we see that state capture, by privileging a few narrow interest groups, neutralizes voice and undermines the rights of the least powerful. And it also has national security implications because it opens the doors to strategic corruption. We see that Russia and China are increasingly interested in investing in ways that are corrosive in strategic sectors of the economy. So they're investing in a way that is non-transparent and not market-oriented, but is for political reasons. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Danny, and he's going to continue to talk about some of the impact before going into the measurement.
Thank you all. Thanks, Liz. This was great. Yeah, the first comment on impact, building on what you just said, where Liz, you may have been a bit on the humble side by saying that you think that the cost of state capture is probably higher than of traditional corruption. Hopefully now with the new measures and data and so on, we'll be able to do, and many will be encouraged to do the research and the analysis and look into these issues of cost. But a priori, imagine the orders of magnitude of difference that it makes to misshape, distort, and change the rules of the game as compared with just getting around the rules of the game, which was a traditional way of looking at corruption for very long. That has been evolving a bit. So from an a priori standpoint, I not only want to echo, but reinforce that point that the enormity of the cost and the consequences of state capture. Now, quickly back to the future, what you were referring to, Liz, in the early work with Joel Hellman, partner of crime on this, we looked at the countries in transition from the former Soviet countries and socialist countries, and we tried to codify with significant surveys that we did, and they were done over time then by EBRD, the World Bank, and so on for many years, which still continues to an extent that. And we found like countries like Azerbaijan and Russia with extremely high levels of capture, whether basically the capture was a presidential decrease by the so-called oligarchs, other powerful groups, parliamentary legislation, or even central bank influence. In sharp contrast, and that's the interesting thing, there was enormous variation with countries like Estonia, other Baltic countries, and at the time Hungary, which is poignant considering what has been happening in more recent times. So this is just to show that metrics and measurement from the very start was extremely important to basically analyze and codify the problem. Now, we also found, and I was talking about the consequences, dire consequences of capture. In essence, we found from those surveys of firms that in countries that were subject to significant capture, high capture countries, both output and investment of the private sector, the competitive private sector, was about 1/2 those in those countries that avoided state capture. So that was back then. So now into the future now. Why measure? Why a state capture index now? So there's been a lack of cross-country measures, including multi-year, for that increasingly studied and relevant phenomena, as Liz just mentioned it. We know from famous Lord Kelvin for the temperature. He famously said it cannot be measured, it cannot be controlled. So the advantages of measurement and data are clear. The a priori that we have discussed is that state capture is not the same as corruption, at least went through this, and it's not the same than absence of rule of law. It's a distinct notion, a distinct concept. And of course, with data, if there is variance over time and over space, that's a goldmine for research and for policy analysis. What kind of state capture index at a conceptual level? This is based on basic premises that we started from the beginning, but that has significantly evolved over time. As Liz mentioned, where non-state actors and state actors can be captors, can engage in capture. So in terms of this new measure, it can encompass state capture, what we could call not only of the state, which is by the non-state actors, so by the corporate, but also state capture by the state leaders. So it's a bit distinct, but it's also a part of the broadening of the study and the term. The main components to inform the state capture index are the extent of capture is taking place in the rule of law side, the judiciary, the police, and those type of institutions, as opposed to the policy side and the polity side, governmental, executive side, as well as the third component, which is very important, in addition of taking seriously that we rely on various sources, and any source and any of these indicators has a margin of error, then we basically feature these three major components here that inform the state capture index, the rule of law, polity and policy, but the third is very important too. To that extent, there is a capture enabling environment or ecosystem in terms of overall absence of voice and accountability, the regulatory framework, corruption, more broadly speaking, as well as an extremely unequal distribution of wealth, what we rely, in fact, on many different variables from three distinct sources that basically and don't want to take too much of the time, so we have a discussion, but it's all in an article recently out, which you can find in the Results for Development Governance Action Hub site under state capture for details, but this is a slide saying, trust me, there are dozens of variables from these three different sources, particularly from VDEM and others, but that includes also this source for very unequal distribution of wealth as basically a proxy for an equal distribution of influence and power. And I have to stress that much of this has to rely on proxies of state capture. There are no direct measures of state capture, like there's a problem also with any corruption indicator. Now, let's go quickly so that then I can get to the more practical side and then conclude so we can have a discussion through what is the data, this initial effort showing. So it does show, as we suspected, that these are not the same phenomena, corruption and capture. For some countries, they're very similar in terms of relative levels. So we see the Norways and the Netherlands on the far left, both of them are very low in them. But once we get to countries like my own, Chile, United States, or the United Kingdom, we're sitting right now, these are countries that exhibit significant more capture than corruption. They're more capture than corrupt. But then it can happen the other way around with some countries, like in the case of Slovakia and Greece on the far right. So basically, we are capturing distinct terms. In fact, if we look at all the countries that are in the data set, which are about 174, and this is since 1996. But in this program, it's just for the last period. Then we do see that there is a very significant dispersion. Of course, the correlation is very, very high, but there are many countries that are much more captured than corrupt, relatively speaking, and there are many countries in the opposite direction. If you wonder why the color coding, well, the red countries are non-democracies, and the green are democracies. There are different extents. That's why some are darker green or darker red and so on. But essentially, that's a cut we use. And the interesting thing, and not surprising, is of course, the non-democracies tend to be more captured and basically by the political leaders. But within democracy, there's a significant dispersion as well. And it's more oligarchic or non-state oriented. But basically, it's not as if basically if you are a democracy, you don't face this challenge, and if you're non-democracy, the other way around. It's a much more nuanced picture. The other and not unrelated finding by looking at this data, when we compare basically extent of corruption traditionally measured like through the worldwide governance indicators, but similarly with TI, CPI, and we compare it to the state capture index, we have been basically underestimating the extent of some of these challenges for the advanced economies. For the high-income countries, basically, again, like what we saw for the US, UK, and Chile, it comes out on average too, that they're more captured than the traditional corruption indices we're assessing. And conversely, although slightly so, for the middle and lower income economies where we may have been pointing too many fingers in terms of the traditional corruption without having focused sufficiently on higher income countries. With the data, it's of use and interest, and I hope you'll be interested in using quite a bit with the caution required. We can track countries also over time. So what we see here is interesting in terms of the different trajectories of countries. There are countries like the US, the UK, and Uruguay, mid-1990s, start from a very similar base of relatively low capture. US, it increases significantly, particularly certain periods. UK somewhat, and Uruguay basically declines with a more recent type of hiccup. And of course, Norway is one of the benchmarks alongside other Nordics and Netherlands and so on. So it shows that a significant change can happen. But of course, this slide goes only up to 40, not to 100. So it's relative capture, but it's not at the top of what a captured country would be. As Liz mentioned, this is a whole spectrum. And they say once we move to another part of the world, we see what has happened. It's interesting, but not surprising that Russia and Ukraine, 1996, 98, start from exactly the same point, which is not surprising, but they go in different trajectory, particularly in more recent decade and so on. Hungary, as Liz already mentioned, is in the trajectory in the data, as well as Turkey, a similar trajectory. In terms of briefly what can be done about it without doing full justice to it now, but we can expand during the discussion. The way we like to look at it, and also this relates to work we have done in terms of prevention of this with Pablo de Grave and others related to NYU and the UN. There are some broad contextual elements that one has to take place in terms of strategies to prevent state capture. And that comes out from the data, it will be very useful, is to develop early warning systems. And of course, diagnostic tools will help. We'll have a minute on that. But looking at even at these indicators that come out from the state capture index, we see obviously the two extremes of totally uncaptured countries and then close to full capture. We just saw one, but there are many in the middle, and they may be in the wrong direction of travel. So this type of tools and data tools can provide already early warning for prevention. It's very important as part of the broad approach to probe into the inequality of influence, which is at the core, in essence, in this whole spectrum of how a country basically evolves into a more or less capture society. And within inequality of influence, obviously the inequality on the political and economic spheres is absolutely critical. Checking on what is, on the one hand, the main vulnerabilities in the checks and balances in a country that are required to be addressed because of the undue influence and state capture, versus what are the areas of strengths and entry points, which almost every country would have, because it's a significant variation across institutions and other aspects within a country in terms of the degree to which they are subject to capture. And then in terms of focusing beyond the illicit, because this is related to legal corruption and legal capture, it's very, very important to abandon the overly legal sense of what's beyond the rule of law as it exists presently. After all, if a setting is relatively captured, the non-state and state actors would ensure that the norms, existing legal norms, would allow them to do many of these things within the law, avoiding legal jeopardy. So this is key to recognize these aspects. And the broad point that having a multi-stakeholder approach beyond just the traditional government involving civil society, the role of politicians and corporate is critical. And we think the point of engaging in more diagnostics at the country level, which has been done in the past for governance and anti-corruption in general, as we have done when I was at the World Bank, but also in Natural Resource Governance Institute. The TI has done it, thanks to Robert and his colleagues, and so on. But already with the state capture index, one can go to the different dimensions and start probing where some of the initial vulnerabilities may lie. It's interesting that for some reason, the expert would know more that in the UK, it's more in the polity and policy aspect than in terms of rule of law, and the overall ecosystem seem to be more robust, for instance. While in countries like Russia, which are not here, everything is enormously challenged. Brazil has its own challenges, and Mexico enormously so, and increasingly so these days, as we know. Now, in terms of getting to the specifics for this diagnostic for prevention that would not need to be elaborated, and I'm not going to go through the details, but I think it's worth stating that very practically and very diligently, and with the experts in the country in a multi-stakeholder approach, one has to look at some of the key dimensions, many of which already Liz mentioned, and particularly for prevention of fuller state capture. Public access issues in non-producing process, like open public hearing, participatory procedures, and so on, transparency. The regulatory and oversight mechanism, including whistleblower and lobby regulation, is critical. Then a very different dimension is about the electoral process, political engagement, standard campaign financing, and so on. And then there's a whole bucket around information transparency and technology integration, which includes the huge issue that Liz has been working on and other colleagues on procurement, transparency, and then on basically e-transparency, accountability, like the work of EITI in this is also important. International context is critical also nowadays, because some of the state capture is happening transnationally, and that's important, as well as the sectoral focus. And they are, in terms of focus on vulnerable sectors, not only finance, which is obvious, but also the commodities and extractives, and how to address in that context the climate change issues, which is being subject right now as we speak to capture as well. The role of civil society and of a participatory process is absolutely key in this context. So I think with what we have right now and all this audience, we don't need to belabor on that. So let me just conclude that what we are trying basically to offer here is something beyond traditional governance and corruption issue, which is more dedicated focus on state capture. We're challenging that these type of notions are unmeasurable, and it's very important to build on the evidence. The issue, again, I stress, of inequality of influence is a key factor, which kind of intersects with the notion that we're talking about a capture spectrum. So it can be undue, extreme, or not so extreme inequality of influence, leading to fuller or less so capture. And that's why that's important for prevention before full capture takes place. Identifying which countries and the selection and self-selection of countries that say, well, we may be doing not that bad, but we're very concerned about our direction of travel, what to do about it, avoiding a descent to fuller state capture, like what we now witness in countries like Russia. It would be key in the practical terms in what type of countries to work on. And within that, working in a participatory diagnostic and prevention action process. By the way, for natural resources and more on the corruption side, but a bit on state capture, this has been done also within by organizations supporting local actors like the Natural Resource Governance Institute, where I used to work. I think we have present today some of the leaders working on those issues. TI has done some of that work in the past. We did it in the World Bank, but not so dedicated about state capture. But it's to stress the point that this is feasible and working within country, and also results for development governance action hub. Now we're starting that type of work. In terms of the work ahead, was briefly mentioned, is critical to focus more on the consequences on security. We see it already with what's happening with some of the developments, including in the Middle East, but also in other countries, the descent away from democracy in many countries, which relates to our issue, but also, and we haven't discussed this enough, but it's worth doing more research with this data, linking it to the extent to which countries are committed and are doing sufficiently in terms of addressing climate change, because obviously the priority is that countries that are subject to higher levels of capture, both by the corporates or by the politicians and the political leaders, are less likely to work on that. So these issues are very important also for addressing the climate crisis. And before ending, again, stressing the notion of partnerships in addressing capture. Let's keep in mind that capture, as opposed to traditional administrative corruption, is not transactional between two individuals and we try to find who bribed whom, and that's it. We're talking about elaborated networks with nodes that work in a systemic fashion, including many, many individuals, very powerful individuals and groups colluding. To fight that, we also need networks. And maybe these could be the source, this type of discussion, and having these hundreds of people today with us here, of basically getting some interest in terms of formation of further networks of that. There are some organizations and some of us working on that, but eventually there has to be a network that can essentially address these very insidious networks, which are global nowadays, related to state capture. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry about that technical hitch. I was complimenting the speakers on giving us some really fascinating views there, and also those who have put questions in the chat, because there are some great questions in there. Unfortunately, in our remaining 15 minutes, we won't get to all of those, but don't stop that putting more questions in, because it's always interesting to see how the debate is unfolding. I'll pick up as many as I can. I want to ask a couple of very simple questions first off to Danny and Liz. Danny, the first one is simply a factual one. What's the institutional home for your state capture index? Where can we find the data and the information?
Okay, go to the state capture page in the think tank called Results for Development. And within that, there is a major new program, the Governance Action Hub. But basically by just looking for my name, the state capture and results for development, you will find access to the state capture page, and there you can get to the article, you can get to the data, you can get to a summary blog and related information. Let me take just 30 seconds to stress that so much, basically all the work I've done, and you mentioned it earlier, Robert, I appreciate that. It's collaborative. That's why my last call to networks. And in the case of the data or state capture index, I want to thank Saba Gifford, who helped me tremendously. But from the very beginning, Joel Hellman was my partner on that. I've been partnering, and that's why we're doing this now together with Liz and so on. And I want to thank also Results for Development for the collaboration and the support in all this.
Thank you, Danny. I'm going to give Danny a rest for a moment and ask Liz a question, which is, Liz, we've heard in the US about Project 2025, should Donald Trump be re-elected as president. How consciously do you think people are coming into power now and thinking about state capture? Is there a plan, or do they just work their way into it?
Yeah, great question. I think, what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years is there's been this progressive violation of democratic norms. And in a way, what the people who've done that, some of the front runners of that in a way, in terms of Putin and Orban and Erdogan, they've seen that there isn't really that much pushback. In Hungary, Orban's continued to be able to be a member of the EU with really very little pushback on that until quite recently, and even then fairly weak. So I think what's interesting is that we've seen people in a way testing the ground. And now we see people becoming, or leaders becoming more and more ambitious and explicit in the way that they are engaging in capturing the state. So I think that's quite a worrying trend, and it does really highlight the need for the local decentralized pushback all the time of not allowing this to get too far, because it's so difficult to reverse once you've taken these steps towards greater capture.
Great, thank you, Liz. And thank you also to those people who have been posting links into the chat. For example, John Heathershaw put some very useful links to papers, including Liz's on state capture and I see that Ruslan Stefanov has also put in the link to where we can find the state capture index. And in fact, I was going to pick out Ruslan's question, who asks, what are the outstanding gaps in state capture research and its implication for policymaking? What should we be focusing on from now on? And that also links to a couple of the other questions. There's one from T.I. Ireland about the extent to which legal corruption, your early work, Danny, is reflected in the index. And another question from Peter Evans on whether major sectors that are capturable, like the power sector, are well reflected.
You want to go first on the research?
Yeah, okay. So I think there are lots of gaps in the research. So there have been research often on individual countries in terms of particularly looking at sort of the impact on the economy and on firms. So we've had research on Tunisia and Egypt and Pakistan looking at the impact on the economy, finding that there's reduced investment, reduced competition, lower productivity of crony firms. So we've got that kind of thing. What we don't have much is focus on individual sectors. So what is the impact of capturing infrastructure or key utilities? There seem to be big impacts if you only have to look at South Africa and the fact that there are huge electricity shortages and outages every day to see some of the impact of state capture there on Eskom. So I think more of that would be good, more diagnostics. And of course, there is great work being done by the Centre for the Study of Democracy as part of the GIA's programme, which is also very much contributing to this and is making links between state capture and illicit financial flows and the anti-corruption regulatory environment in individual countries. I'm sure Danny has much to add.
Well, I'll just add what I mentioned earlier first. I think a focus on state capture during the climate crisis era is very, very important, because the a priori links are obvious, but we haven't done the empirical research on what type of capture may matter more or less for why we're not making sufficient progress on that. We all know, and it's quite obvious, what's happening recently in terms of the oil majors, basically reneging on the commitments to transition, right? And they have been becoming increasingly emboldened about that. In many ways, it's a mirror image of what Liz just mentioned about the autocrats doing with impunity. So I think more limelight and more work of how this is happening and what's happening in the boardrooms at the corporate level, and why that at the national level also regarding climate change. I mean, to have a country with its human rights record and with its oil record, like Azerbaijan hosts the COP29, and personally, we have friends who have been abused and imprisoned and so on, who are there, like Gubadi Wadoglu, who work with us at the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and the suffering that he has been for being an activist and for calling for accountability, that those type of countries are the hosts of COP29 at the very basic level. That's obviously a case study of capture, but I think a more systematic work it's needed. The same related to the descent into a much more violent, less peaceful and insecure world. Basically, the leadership nowadays in the Middle East by all factions involved, and what happened with them, and the attempts to judiciary and other capture in the case of Israel, which we all know very well, and the links between that and what's happening throughout the Middle East, and of course the leadership of the terrorist groups and so on. It's another matter, but that's all related to issues of governance, of capture, and of countries that have undergone that would, and also with new data that could be looked significantly more. And one more point, the fact that I made the decision to do an integration between the two forms of capture of the state by the oligarchs, that's how we started, the non-state actors getting well, as well as the newer work on state actors doing the capture, so capture by state leaders of the institutions of the state. And that's integrated into the index, but with clear distinction of what's more autocratic capture and what's within a democracy, in part should help in terms of promoting some research where countries that are in fragile transition democracies by entering the spectrum of possible state capture, risk falling into autocratic behavior and to descent away from democracy. Certainly, Russia is a case study on that. That starts with the oligarchs, and now we're looking at the other side of the mirror. But is that an exception that proves some kind of rule, or there is also a potential continuum of that descent, which is very much linked to state capture, which I think is worth for some political scientists and empiricists to look into that more. Lastly, at the practical level, the further development of these diagnostic tools, which we were referring to, and working at the country level in case study. And I know that there are discussions on that among different partners, and perhaps a part of the new network would be very useful for countries that are serious and want to do something about it, not something academic from the outside.
Thank you, Danny. I'm going to pick up a question now from Varsha Patel from the University of Cape Town, who has actually smuggled in quite a few questions, but I'm going to pick up just one of them, which is about the Zondo Commission in South Africa, and whether the framework and recommendations from the Zondo Commission, first of all, whether they can feed into your work on state capture, but secondly, whether you think there's a wider applicability beyond South Africa.
Let's start on that as a having.
You worked those. Yeah. We both work.
I think the Zondo Commission is a really fantastic resource, partly because it's through getting testimony from a couple of hundred witnesses, it's given us a lot more insight into many of the mechanisms by which this happened. So I do think it is great. I think the recommendations have wider utility, but I also think that actually it's something that we need to always look at the individual situation of the country and understand what exactly happened in capture there, and be able to then make country-specific recommendations. And one of the issues that I'm going to be researching in the next couple of years with Tom Shipley under the GIACE programme is around thinking about the dilemmas of recovery from state capture, because it is not easy to pull back from state capture. And there are a lot of really tricky dilemmas. I mean, if you've got whole institutions that have been captured and you can't really, even if you have a change of government, an incoming regime, how do they deal with that? Do they need to entirely purge all of the people in order to be able to trust that institution? Do they abolish it? There are problems with doing that. There are technical problems around losing capacity and institutional history, but there are also serious problems around then being open to the accusation that you're also engaging in state capture. So I think that's a really tricky set of problems. It often happens in a situation where there's really heavy public pressure to achieve results quickly. So that's something that we would like to research a lot more.
Let me just add, and I may get into trouble with some, but I take my hat off to what South Africa did. And I'm biased because I was one of those, and with Joel Hellman, we did testimony to the Zondo Commission and so on, who were involved in that process. And not because we were experts in South Africa, but they wanted to know as much as possible how this whole work started and what are the lessons learned from other countries and so on. But I take my hat off that first, they called basically the commission, the focus and the first report, the whole focus was not on a corruption scandal, was on state capture. So they said this is different, this is major, this is big. So that was first. And second, they institutionally and politically they reacted. Of course, there's much homework ahead, but it's a country that created a commission, reacts in many other different ways, and in a fundamental sense, avoided a descent to total capture. Was in the spectrum, but it was not totally captured. I mean, how many of us, Latin America, the Nicaraguas and the Venezuelas of the Hungary and Russia and so on? No, South Africa avoided that trap. It has other challenges, but at the same time, they made very, very important reforms and so on. So I think, and I hope it's eventually written historical as a case study also, that there was an intervention at crucial times. And that's a part of the plea and discussion here today. There are so many countries in the middle and so on, and they are struggling, but with leadership and both in government and outside, recognizing, yes, we have a problem, but it's timely for prevention, and let's intervene.
Thank you both. Our time is sadly drawing to a close. There are so many fantastic questions in the chat. We could easily spend a further hour or two talking through those, but unfortunately there isn't time. This session has been recorded and we'll make it available afterwards. We'll send a link round as to where you can find it, which should also have details of the questions if you want to review those and think about them. I'm just going to ask Liz and Danny to give a last word before I give an advert for our next seminar. Both of you, if you had one recommendation as to what people should take away from this session, what would it be? Starting with Liz.
I think actually citizens need to do more. It's obviously not their responsibility when a country moves into state capture, but I do think it's really important to call out state capture where you see it. So I think the early warning signs, we need to be monitoring and calling them out and pushing back.
Thank you. Danny.
Well, Liz already said it. So what I will say, yes, activist participation, and that's why the notion of creating an active network on that. If that's coupled also with rigorous analysis and with data, so we should not, in spite of the fake news era and all what's happening, instead of abandoning the search and the investment in data effort, data can be enormously powerful, particularly if it is complemented by in-depth diagnostic and by the participatory process of preparing plans and reforms with civil society, with the corporates, and there are many corporates in the private sector that want basically improve governance and less state capture. They would benefit from that. So to do this in a collective action, multi-stakeholder activist approach could be a game changer with more dedicated focus on state capture, even if it's politically incorrect. It's sensitive in some terms, but abandoning the very tame type of language which we tend to use in terms of systems and so on. We're talking about peoples, about leaders, some very corrupt, very capturing, others that want to reform and so on. So we're talking about very sensitive issues. We should continue to speak truth to power and engage with everybody. And the engagement with data, by the way, and that's my last point, helps enormously in basically managing the political sensitivities when talking to interlocutors that may be at first allergic or adverse of that issue. If the data shows what's happening and so on, then it helps. It doesn't fully resolve it, but it helps.
Danny, Liz, thank you both very much indeed. A great session. I learned a lot and I'm sure everybody else did. Please do join us on November the 7th, next month, for the second in our ACE seminar series. Professor Paul Hayward, who directs our GI ACE program here at the Centre for the Study of Corruption, will be speaking about sector-based action against corruption. That picks up on several of the themes that were there in the chat and the questions. So we'll be looking at sectors with Paul in a month's time. And thereafter, we'll have monthly seminars hosted in turn by ourselves and our colleagues at SOC ACE, University of Birmingham, and at SOAS ACE. We'll send the links around and please do join us in future. Thank you all for coming. Sorry I couldn't get to all your questions, but it was great to have this discussion and hopefully see you on November the 7th. Goodbye.
Thank you.